You can find me out here on the front lines of the war on Christmas, which the left pretends does not exist, which many people on the right pretend does not exist. But we've had many fights in this country over the propriety of Christmas celebrations, of public Christmas displays. We've had cases go all the way up to the Supreme Court on the legality of celebrating Christmas in the public square. So I just don't want to hear it anymore, that there is no such thing as a war on Christmas. But the war on Christmas is a very complex topic, as is all a matter of religious liberty. So thankfully, to help us clear it up, we are joined by Emilie Kao, the director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. Emilie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Michael.
Emilie, I have heard a lot of different stories about the propriety of having Christmas displays in public, or the creche, nativity scenes, or even Santa Claus and Frosty the Snowman. I know this has gone up to the Supreme Court before. The people who don't want the displays come out and they say, this is a secular country founded on a firm separation between church and state, and therefore you're not allowed to have the nativity display in public, and frankly, you shouldn't even have Merry Christmas written anywhere either. Then on the other hand, you have religious people, I'd probably count myself in this camp, who say that separation between church and state is overstated. Obviously, it appears nowhere in the Constitution. The nation was founded as a Christian country by the zealots on the Mayflower, all the way up through the Christian tradition that has informed so much of our national culture. Where does the reality really lie? Where is the constitutionality and the legality of acknowledging and celebrating Christmas in public?
Well, thanks for having me on. I think that the Constitution is clear that the government has to allow the free exercise of religion. And in many communities, that still is the free exercise of religion around showing Christmas displays. And while that does have to be balanced with the Establishment Clause, which doesn't allow the government to establish a religion, that has not prevented the Supreme Court from saying that Christmas displays and other religious displays are permissible displays. And we've seen that recently in a case actually with the Peace Cross, which was a World War I memorial that was set up by the American Legion, which the government said violated the Establishment Clause. But actually, the Supreme Court said it didn't violate the Establishment Clause. I'm sorry, the litigants for the separation of church and state said it violated the Establishment Clause, but the court ruled it didn't.
Right, and we've seen other cases like this as well. And I know the Establishment Clause is one issue that I think people kind of misrepresent very often, because there's this strange fact of American history that when the Constitution was ratified, there were various states that had established churches. That, the federal government is saying in the Constitution that at the federal level there can't be a national established church. But there were, and they went away over the following decades, but there were these established churches that in some ways you might say that the reason to separate to some degree church and state is less to protect the state from the church than to protect the church from the state.
That's exactly right. The church has always been in danger from the state trying to establish particular orthodoxies. And that's why we originally had the Establishment Clause, to protect the churches from being violated by the federal government coming in and dictating orthodoxy. Because obviously our nation was founded by people who had seen the state church in England or, in other European countries come in and violate the independence of the church to set its own orthodoxies. And so that is why they created the Establishment Clause, not to create some high wall of separation between the church and state, which would basically create a naked public square. So that's a massive misunderstanding today in the public, that there is, something in the Constitution about a wall of separation between church and state. I think the correct understanding is that the church is meant to be protected from overreach by the government, but to establish orthodoxy. But unfortunately, we see overreach by the government now in so many ways, especially because of the coronavirus and the restrictions on worship that, have been created by so many state governors and mayors.
You see this happening right now, and it reminds me of something I think you're implying here, which is that all societies are going to have certain beliefs. All society, Andrew Breitbart, who's the patron saint of Hollywood conservatives, Breitbart famously said, "Politics is downstream of culture," which is largely true, and culture is downstream of religion. Cult and culture come from the same root word. What a culture worships will define that culture, and everybody's got to serve somebody. So you have a world now in which, because of the coronavirus, public health officials have shut down certain aspects of society, but they've left open others. They've said that doing certain kinds of business, that is essential. Keeping open marijuana dispensaries in California, absolutely essential. Keeping open abortion clinics, absolutely essential services. And yet churches remain closed all around the country because those are considered inessential. And to me, it's an absolute inversion of our constitutional order. But it would appear, as you've said, that might just be the new orthodoxy that the left in this country is trying to establish.
Well, they are trying to establish it. It's been a very up and down year for religious freedom in America. The coronavirus has led several city mayors and governors to implement unconstitutional and unfair restrictions on religious gatherings, much harsher than secular gatherings. But as you know, right before Thanksgiving, the Supreme Court stepped in and they said that, that is unconstitutional. You can't violate free exercise by treating a religious gathering worse than a similar secular gathering, of the same size building and the same size number of people. So I think since the Supreme Court made that decision, we've seen, the effects that freedom has been restored in many states where the lower courts are now listening to the rationale of the Supreme Court. But it's an ongoing problem in our society that many government officials are, overreaching the boundaries of the law, and that they are treating religion as worse than similar secular gatherings. That's not just unconstitutional, that's also bad for public health, because so many Americans rely on their faith and their faith communities to deal with all the stress of the coronavirus.
Of course, it would seem to me if any if any service or any building is essential, it would be church, it would be mass, it would be religious gatherings. But that presumes a view of the world that says that all this matter, all this stuff is not the whole story, that actually there is a metaphysical quality to this world, which basically everybody from the dawn of time until about 5 minutes ago believed, but now we're living in a culture dominated by the orthodoxies of the secular left. And fortunately, the court has held pretty firm on this. As you mentioned, they just recently ruled that these restrictions on churches are wrong. There was a landmark case back in 1984 called Lynch v. Donnelly, where the court said, responding to a challenge to the constitutionality of having Christmas decorations in the public square, they said, no, you're allowed to have Christmas decorations in the public square. So the court has held firm for many, many decades on this. However, if there's one thing I know about the Supreme Court, it's that it disappoints you over time. And, various judges on the court have really gone squishy, they've gone left, they've been disappointing. So what is your view of how the court is going to continue to rule? Is this one area where you think we can trust the court basically to stand firm? Or, like all of these other social institutions and traditions, is it going to be swept away in the leftward wave of progress?
Well, I think that's largely up to the American people. We can't completely rely on the courts, because the courts, while they have made good decisions, they've also made bad decisions. Fortunately, this court, did adhere to the Constitution in its recent decision in the Brooklyn case for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese in Agudath, Israel. But we've seen them make, very poor decisions as well. So religious freedom can't only be protected by the courts. Religious freedom has to be something that's understood by the American people. And I think you're right that, in our increasingly secular country, the value of religious freedom is not understood, because I think we're a less religious people. Obviously, with the rise of the nuns, the NONES, with no religious affiliation, it becomes increasingly challenging for people to understand the value of religious freedom if they themselves are not religious. And we see so much, we see so many messages from our politicians and from the media that are, very negative towards religion. That's, of course, not true, because we see that, so much of the country still relies on their religious beliefs, strength, and religion is the source of so much charitable service, and so much of our community in this country is because we have, religion at the center of those communities. So we have a lot of issues with misunderstanding religion and religious freedom in our culture, and that feeds into, our laws, and that of course is what the courts are interpreting. So it can't just be an argument about the courts. It has to be an entire movement from our culture to restore understanding of religion and religious freedom.
Right. I totally agree. And, I quoted Andrew Breitbart a second ago where he says politics is downstream of culture. Now I kind of want to argue against that a little bit too, though, and say culture also is affected by political decisions. As you've seen religion ebb in this country, or, kind of traditional religion, and be replaced by leftist orthodoxy, you have seen that follow from major decisions. One, to kick the Bible teaching out of schools, to kick prayer out of schools, to more or less censor what the churches are permitted to say about politics. This happened during the mid-20th century, or they could lose their tax-exempt status. There have been serious political changes that have hampered the ability of churches to flourish. Even the way that we now talk about freedom to worship rather than freedom of religion, because, and Barack Obama, I think, was particularly guilty of this. He would describe freedom of worship because that is in many ways a private act rather than freedom of religion, which involves a lot of public things. It involves more actions that are more involved in the community. So I wonder, beyond just raising your families right and taking your kids to church on Sunday and, these kind of non-political ways of rebolstering America's religious spirit, is there anything that we can do within politics, something we can hope for at the legislative level, at the executive level, even at the court level, or are we more or less on our own?
Well, I think Americans absolutely need to live out their faith in public in every way. Religious freedom isn't, as you said, just the freedom to worship in your own home. It's the freedom to, think, to speak, to act according to your religious beliefs in every part of the public square. But that is under threat by laws and policies, and increasingly so in the U.S. Congress. Your listeners probably know about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which restored the highest level of scrutiny to government burdens on religious freedom. But that's now under attack from Democrats who've introduced the Do No Harm Act in Congress. Senator Kamala Harris was the main sponsor of that, which would gut the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It would make it inapplicable in cases involving abortion and claims of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But beyond that, even, we see the imposition of the secular orthodoxy through bills like the Equality Act that would impose this, radical sexual orthodoxy on the entire country, which of course would severely shrink the religious freedom of institutions and individuals. And it wouldn't only affect people who are in the wedding industry, like the bakers, the florists, and photographers. Right. It would also affect, religious institutions, which, again, it's not just houses of worship. It's not just a church or a synagogue or a mosque. It's also, faith-based hospitals. It's, Christian schools. It's all sorts of institutions that our society has relied on for so many years, including faith-based child welfare, adoption, and foster care agencies. All of them would be forced to conform to this new transgender ideology, and they would be forced to affirm same-sex marriage in violation of, our first freedom to follow our religious beliefs and our consciences. So it's not just restricting our practice of faith in the public square, it's actually forcing us to assent to a new orthodoxy.
Yeah, that's right. To adopt the new established religion, which is ironic because that is what the cultural radicals are arguing against. And I think you're absolutely right. The way that we push against this is by living it out, by opposing these radical laws that are being pushed, by defending our own laws to defend our own traditional understanding of religion. That requires a number of virtues, including a forgotten virtue, which is courage. But that's the prerequisite of all the other virtues. Thank you so much, Emilie, for being here. Emilie Kao from the Heritage Foundation.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. With more than 500,000 members, we are the nation's largest conservative research and education institution. We believe the principles and ideas of the American founding are worth conserving and renewing. Please help us further our mission by subscribing to this channel and sharing our videos with your family and friends.